And now I'm going to let everybody in.
Especially with the nice weather, right?
Oh my goodness, I see Christina Del Balso.
Hi, Loretta. Hi, Michael Beck.
Yeah, I think so. You know, who knows? The travel.
How are you, Loretta? Are you still in Florida?
I'm in Fla, another few weeks.
Lucky you, because we had.
The botanical garden.
How's your ankle?
I'm driving and walking. Slowly.
Very good.
I have physical therapy once a week just to keep me honest.
Glad to know that. Let's see who's here.
Yeah.
I'm Mary Jane.
Road trip, but it's around Australia and New Zealand, correct?
Oh, there's Jackie.
Then I don't see it.
Yeah. I'm not.
Oh, there it is.
How many days exactly?
What?
How many days?
For what?
The next trip.
2 days.
Should we ask everybody to mute themselves?
I'll do that right now.
Oh, I don't know.
What, this thing?
One of them will mute you and the other one will let you
Well, it's a
talk. I don't
plus.
know what it is.
Okay, this is good. So, all righty, it's 3:02. We have a very lovely, lively group this afternoon. I think maybe we'll just sort of get going and we can admit the stragglers as they come in, Amy, we can do that. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. I've been very thrilled over the last few months to see a lot of new volunteer names coming in, and I also see a lot of wonderful old friends here. Christina, can you mute, because I'm hearing Paul chat with you. As nice as it is to hear his voice.
I thought mine says mute.
Yeah, hit mute. Good. Now you're muted. All right. So so I just want to welcome you all and tell you this is the first of 3 training sessions we're having for volunteers. Some of you are so experienced, you're going to be like, ho hum, I think I know this all. But you know, we missed last year, so we could all be a little rusty. I'm glad to have refresher courses in the history and all the stuff we're going to cover over the next 3 sessions. And let's see, what else did I want to tell you? Oh, Amy asked me, we have Amy Butterworth here, who is our volunteer coordinator on staff. Of course, we have Mike Beck, our executive director, and I am Loretta Harris, in case you don't know me. I'm the president of the BBG Volunteer Association. It's a voluntary role. And after a number of years, I'm still doing it. So that tells you how wonderful you all are and how much fun you are to work with. So we're going to turn this over to Mike really quickly. I did just want to, I promised Amy I would remind you all, because we are starting our tour guide season up soon. The jobs are posted. You can go onto the BBG website and you click on the volunteer page, and then you click on, volunteer to do something. The page, you'll get some options to come up. Click on volunteer jobs, and you'll see the tour guide slots listed, and you can sign up for they go from 11 to 12, just about every day. And Amy, are they all listed now? Because when I went on, I only saw them for June. They're all listed? Okay, all right. So without further ado, unless there was something I forgot to say, I'm going to turn this over. This very interesting, fascinating, and fact-filled explanation of from whence BBG came and where we're going and how incredibly lucky we all are to be here. So take it away, Mike.
All right, thank you, Loretta, and thanks, Amy. I'm going to do my best to share the screen now, and hopefully that will work. No. 1 second.
was working perfectly a minute ago.
Of course.
There we go.
All right, can everyone see my slide here? Okay.
Yes.
All right, let me get going. So thank you all. I want to start this session or this series of talks, I guess. This is prompted by our upcoming season. We're also excited to have the season being back to close to normal for 2021, where we're looking forward to terrific programs all summer long. And of course, we couldn't do it without the hard work of all the volunteers who help us daily, weekly, seasonally, yearly, all the time. This was prompted primarily because we're training our tour guides for the season. I know many of you are already tour guides or thinking of becoming tour guides for the season, which is terrific. But I know there's also a bunch of other volunteers or people who are curious about becoming volunteers here at the garden. So what I thought I'd do today is give you a little bit of an overview about the garden itself, you know, a little bit of a bird's eye view, its past, what we currently do around here, and also a glimpse of a somewhat exciting future that we have in mind here. And especially if you've been volunteering here for a while, you probably know some of these facts already. So just think of this as a bit of a resource. We're recording the session today, so you can draw from that. And I'm going to go pretty fast today because I have quite a few slides to cover. So if you miss something, again, you can go back to the recording later and take a closer look at what I'm going to show you today. The title of my talk today is a bit of a riff on the fact of how old of an organization we really are. We were founded in 1934. I have another talk in the can that's called Confessions of an 80-Year-Old Public Garden. Of course, time flies because in just a few years, BBG will actually be turning 90 years old. So, you know, never a dull moment around here. You know, this image here is kind of encapsulates what BBG is all about. It's a beautiful cultural landscape. For those of you who have participated in this year's winter lecture, we heard from Charles Birnbaum, who was telling us all about cultural landscapes and their significance. So we're a cultured space within a cultured environment of the Berkshires and also the natural beauty of the Berkshires. So of course, I think for our visiting population, people coming as visitors to the garden, that's probably the primary draw of coming to BBG, this kind of an iconic image of the beautiful garden surrounded by the Berkshire Hills. But of course, there's more to BBG, and the history of a place is really important as well. So that's going to be a little bit of the focus of my talk today. So when I started here in 2013 as interim executive director, and then I became executive director in 2014, I knew I was stepping into a very historic cultural organization. And it was really great hearing a lot about the history of the garden, primarily orally. So I call this the oral history part of this. And pictured here are two of my favorite former staff members at BBG. On the top is Dora Veed, who was long-serving director of horticulture here at BBG, and below her is Elizabeth Carey, who was long-serving director of education. When I started here together, among them, they had more than 40 years under their belts at BBG. So a terrific resource, of course, to hear about the history and who did what at the garden at what time. So I was all ears about that when I started here. And of course, there are many other people who've been involved with the garden for many, many years, long-serving board members, former board members, staff members, volunteers such as yourselves, and just people in the community. So I heard a lot about the garden. Most of it true, I believe. And then, of course, there's the physical history of BBG as well. There's our buildings adapted for use over the decades. There were plans and maps that I found, photos, even the older trees on property and the shrubs. They all tell a history of a place. You know, you could really hire a full-time historian to put it all together. And it was fun to do, but you know, I only have so much time in my day. So I started putting these things together, and this kind of a talk is sort of the result of that. But early on in my research, I also came upon some written files, and this was a really helpful little booklet. As you can see, this was written in the 1950s after the first 20 years of BBG. It was still called the Berkshire Garden Center then. And it was a pretty detailed little booklet that talked about every single meeting that happened, every single board meeting, lecture, new garden beds conceived and planted, the names of all officers and staff members, the big news, the small news. And we could spend all day with this little booklet, but I'm gonna spare you some of the details and just focus on the highlights. So in this book, the writing says, it starts off by saying, in 1934, in one of the corners of the crossroads of a crossroads in Stockbridge, a garden appeared. It was unlike any other garden in the Berkshires because it stood open for everyone to visit. And I thought that was a really interesting way to start this written history of BBG. I think it's strange for a garden to just suddenly appear, but it basically did. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. It was sort of against all odds. But I want to put things in context. In 1934 was really the end of an era here in the Berkshires. It was the end of the era of the Gilded Age and the great cottages in Stockbridge and Lenox, which of course was an era of fancy private gardens. But this was very different. It was a public garden. So what I like to do is always turn around and see what all of our other cultural organizations in the Berkshires are up to. That's sort of part of my job. And so I thought for context, it would be interesting to see what other of our big name cultural organizations in the Berkshires were up to in 1934 when we were founded. We have just a critical mass of them here in the Berkshires, and this is what makes the region so special. So what were they up to? I'm going to start here with Edith Wharton and the Mount. So in 1934, she was still very busy publishing. She was writing an autobiography called A Backward Glance, but she had actually left the Mount, the home that she built back in 1911, so a long time ago, and she never returned to the area. The building, the Mount Mansion, was still a private residence in 1934. It would later become the Fox Hollow School. It would then host Shakespeare and Company before they moved. And it didn't take its current shape as the Edith Wharton restoration until sometime in the 1980s. So worth keeping in mind. Next, we have Naumkeag and a beautiful portrait of Mabel Choate, the owner, next to a photograph of Fletcher Steele, who was her garden designer. So in 1934, Mabel had just inherited the estate from her mother. She lived in the grand McKim Mead and White home for another 24 years or so. And she created these beautiful gardens that we all love and like to visit with Fletcher Steele over many, many decades following this. So Naumkeag itself, of course, did not open to the public until after her death, and that was in 1958. When we talk about Stockbridge, of course, we can't forget Norman Rockwell and his iconic paintings. So in 1934, he was still very busy working on covers for the Saturday Evening Post. He didn't move to the area and to Stockbridge until the 1950s, 1953. And he hadn't even conceived some of his most famous works, including the Four Freedoms in 1943. The Rockwell Museum didn't open until 1969 in downtown Stockbridge, and then it moved to the present location in 1994, I believe. Now, of course, it's our biggest cultural neighbor, drawing more than 128,000 visitors a year. So I definitely wanted to have a shout out there. So who are these lovely folks? Of course, they're the Shakers. It was definitely an end of an era for them as well in 1934. There were still a few dozen left living in the City of Peace, as it was called, and other Shaker towns or Shaker compounds. The last Shakers left in the 1950s, and the Hancock Shaker Village in its current incarnation as a living museum was born then. So again, not around when we were in our infancy. And lastly, this dapper gentleman, of course, is Serge Krusovitsky, who was so instrumental in bringing the Boston Symphony and Tanglewood to our area. Here he is shown looking out over Saranac, his beautiful mansion, one of the most beautiful views, I think, in Stockbridge. But in 1934, the BSO was nowhere to be found because it was actually the New York Philharmonic who were invited to be summer concert providers here in the Berkshires. And the Tanglewood property was not gifted to the BSO until 1936. So to sum up, I guess in 1934, many of our peer organizations had yet to be conceived or created while the Berkshire Garden Center was up and running. So I always like to point that out. So going back to BBG, here's an image from that little booklet that I shared with you. It's a little hard to see probably, but it gives you an idea of how much or how little was on our property back in the day in 1934. This top image shows Route 102 looking west towards West Stockbridge. So on the right side, you will have what was called the Triangle property, which was the initial part that became the Berkshire Garden Center in 1934. This was a time of a lot of garden clubs in the area, in the region. Of course, we still have some very active ones to this present day, but back then there were 6 of them just here in the immediate area that got together, formed a committee led by the Lenox Garden Club, and they were presided over by the Lenox Garden Club president at the time, Mrs. Carl de Gersdorf. Remember that name because I'll get back to her in a little while as well. There were other town organizations on this committee, including the Stockbridge Library, the Grange, the Laurel Hill Association. And this committee got together and were talking about the need for a public display garden and public garden in this area. They hadn't made any decisions yet, but apparently the Garden Club Federation of Massachusetts got wind and, quote, enthusiastically endorsed, quote unquote, these plans that they had made back in the fall of 1934. So everyone on the committee started freaking out, saying, well, now the Garden Club Federation knows about this, we're actually going to have to do something. They were going to come out the following spring in 1935 and see how things were going along. So everyone was left scrambling, but by November of 1934, they had formed an organization called the Berkshire Garden Center, and it was to be chaired by a Mrs. Bernard Hoffman. The decision was made to begin the Berkshire Garden Center by the following spring, and they were only going to do it for a year's trial, so they were treading pretty carefully. People also commented that it was somewhat premature to create a garden, so there's a little bit of controversy happening. But the land was decided to be used was this triangle between Route 102 and 183, where we still are to this day. They hired a horticultural director, Mr. Kenneth Simpson. He was actually his father-in-law actually ran the estate at Bellefontaine, which we now know as Canyon Ranch. So Mr. Simpson was really instrumental. He contacted local nurseries. He made the connections with all the big houses in the Berkshires. He asked for donations of plants and seeds, and he went to work plotting out this initial Berkshire Garden Center. Of course, what we now know as the center house, it was then called the main house, and that was also already on property because it's a very old building. And initially, the first use of that building for the Berkshire Garden Center was that half of it was going to become the director's home. He and his wife lived in part of it. And then the other half was going to become the assembly room, library, and office. So the first public use for that space. And then by 1935, I read in the records that apparently too much was taken on. So people were still a little flustered by the whole endeavor, but there were lectures happening. There was a nature walk for children. The daylily garden was already started with 60 donated varieties from the New York Botanical Garden. And most impressive in my view was that the center already had 503 dues paying members. Of course, dues at the time were only 50 cents. So here's a beautiful photo of Irene Botsford Hoffman, who we have to thank for being where we are today. Her family was originally from Chicago. She married Bernard Hoffman, local Stockbridge boy, in 1903. And her family must have had quite a bit of moolah because they lived in a beautiful Prospect Hill house that was given to them as a wedding present by her father. This photo was taken sometime later in Irene's life, obviously, probably presiding over a BBG plant sale, I was told. The Hoffmans had bought the Triangle property in about 1920, and they gave the original buildings and about 8.5 acres of that land to the Berkshire Garden Center sometime after 1936. The Berkshire Garden Center was incorporated in 1941, so right around that time. They also later donated the land on the other side of Route 102, and what is currently our visitor center, that became a brand new building that was built for the director's house, built in 1937. Irene, by the way, was president of the Berkshire Garden Center from 1934 until 1941. So here's one of my favorite historic photos of the garden because it gives you sort of a really good sense of what was there at the time and what was not there, more importantly. So you can see the center house. I don't know if people can see my cursor if I wiggle it around, but on the lower left is the center house, and on the other side of the road is what's now the visitor center. Back then was the living quarters for the director. But not much else is there, including not many trees or plants of any kind. There's some big maples that were in front of the center house that have since come down. but really a dusty road and mostly just fields in the 1930s. So here's a really great early record that I wanted to share with you. And it's a bit of a hard to see image because it is a painted plank piece of wood framed and glazed that is in fact one of the very first planning documents that the Berkshire Garden Center made back in 1938. Early planning was done by someone named Edward Belches, who designed famously our herb garden, which I'll talk about in a little while. And this master plan, beautifully painted, shows some existing features back in 1938, as well as some planned, features that they had planned for the years ahead. There was already an awareness of the busy road, Route 102. Obviously, back then it wasn't as busy as it is now, but some of the design features clearly tried to shield the garden from the road. There were features such as the daylily border. There were plans for a dwarf orchard and also grape arbors, as well as trial gardens. And most impressively, I thought, was that they incorporated parking spots, 8 parking spots back in 1937. By the way, this was found collecting dust in one of our attic areas of Center House when we started the Center House renovation project. So it was a really great treasure that we found and that we're now prominently displaying in our office. I'm going to not spend that much time on early fundraising, although fundraising is near and dear to my heart as the director. But fundraising took off with a bang right early on. And in fact, the Harvest Festival, for which we are so famous, was the very first fundraising event that the garden engaged in back in 1934 to raise funds for their building. Some other historic photos that I uncovered, not sure what the top one is of. It looks like maybe a spring fete that they had, but the lower photo shows the iconic pocket lady that used to participate in Harvest Festival activities. Back to the actual garden areas. This is the herb garden that was actually really important for the development of the garden center. Irene Hoffman was involved with its creation. She gave money towards that. And Edward Belches, who I already mentioned, who did the master planning, he was actually asked to do the design of this area. And for those of you who do tours of the garden, I don't know about you, but I always love showing people this garden. It's a sort of an intimate little spot. It's not the most huge scale garden that BBG has, but it is in fact the oldest existing garden that we have, dating back to 1937. And it sort of put BBG on the map for the reason that it was actually featured on the cover. I don't know if it's the cover or inside, but it was in Horticulture magazine back in 1943. Really a prestigious publication back in the day, of course. And so people saw that and started coming to the Berkshires to take a look at the Berkshire Garden Center in the 1940s. I don't have a lot of other photos from this early era of the garden, but there were lots of things happening. Those orchard areas and grape arbors that I showed you on the master plan, they were in fact completed. There was a children's flower show that began. A demonstration vegetable garden happened in 1941. Our Cuttings magazine was started in that era. And they even started an endowment and rainy day fund. So that was good, of course, as well. Then, of course, the World War II years happened. There was gas rationing. There were canceled lectures. There were, in fact, drawings for war bonds held at Berkshire Garden Center fundraisers. And there was even more emphasis placed on sort of self-sufficiency principles, of course, during the war years. So the Berkshire Garden Center became very well known for teaching people about victory gardens and tending your own vegetables and fruit gardens and so forth, which of course is very au courant again in this day and age. So it's kind of interesting how these things come full circle. I have a note here as well that by 1947, we had over 1,000 members, which I think is truly impressive given how young the garden was at the time. So now we skip ahead to the 1950s, which is sort of a new era for the garden because Roy Boutard became the director here at the Garden Center. And many of you know or remember Roy. He sort of had an outsized influence on the garden and its development. He came to us from Denmark originally via Canada, and he was hired in 1954. And he was sort of a man for all seasons. He really had lots of interests, lots of skills. He loved wildflowers. He was really involved in flower shows, entering on behalf of the Garden Center in Boston and other areas. He won many medals apparently, and he did so much more. He was on the radio, he made TV appearances, he had a weekly column in the Eagle, so kind of just start sweating just thinking about all the things he did. And his wife Sherry was very involved in starting and really promoting education at the garden, specifically youth education. So really sowing the seeds for what we do to this day in terms of educating the community in horticultural areas. Here's an image of Roy a little later in his tenure, probably judging from his hairstyle in the 1970s or so. This was, the 1970s was also an era of rapid change for the country, for the garden center. This is when our new meeting house was built, which is still used as the current exhibit hall and education building. There was seating in it all of a sudden for 200 people, which was really great because thousands of people were coming to the garden center to take classes. There was really an increased emphasis on hands-on programs. And apparently by 1978, more than 4,000 students annually visited the garden on school trips. There was also an increased environmental awareness in that era in the 1970s. There was increased funding from the government, from governmental sources to provide better accessibility. There was an emphasis on horticultural therapy even. So a lot of new areas that were being explored by the garden with input and support from government sources, which I thought was really interesting. We even built our first solar greenhouse at the time, not the one that you currently see, but an earlier version of it. And there were exhibits focusing on gardening for the physically handicapped and so forth. So really a different approach to things. The Roy Boutard era came to an end in 1984 when Roy retired, but the couple actually stayed close by, and Roy passed away in 2010 and his wife Sherry actually survived until 2015. So I was involved with the garden already when I heard the sad news of her passing. And of course, no history of talk about the history of Berkshire Botanical Garden would be complete without mentioning the Herb Associates. They were actually a group founded way back in 1957, and they were founded to, quote, raise funds for the garden center, selling vinegars, sauces, seed cookies and cakes, herb sachets, potpourri, herb charts, cookbooks, and much more. Money was dropped in an honor box attached to a table. So it sounds a lot like what they're still doing to this day. So it's wonderful to have a volunteer organization and a subgroup of the volunteer group that has been active for all this time. They were probably inspired by Irene Hoffman, who herself wrote a book on herb cookery back in 1940 with royalties benefiting the garden. And since 1959, I saw in the records, the Herb Associates have been sponsoring our annual opening weekend celebration, which they call the May Bowl, which will be happening this year on May 2nd. So mark your calendars. Here is a little more recent photo of the Herb Associates, and it was really great to have them back this year. Last year, they were on hiatus because of COVID. So now I'm going to switch gears and spend a little bit of time on the present. The image here was a garden map that we actually used until fairly recently, featuring sort of the core acreage of our gardens. And I'm going to switch, and this is actually our current map. So we've modernized our map, mostly because there were so many new garden areas that were not mentioned on the older map. We now have, of course, the renovated center house that I'll talk a little bit more about. We've got the entry garden in front of that. We have the topiary garden and so forth. So there are a lot of changes happening. This is, by the way, a digital map that I'm very happy with. So as we add new garden areas, we can just add things without having to recreate this from year to year. But I'll also note that our admission numbers have really trended higher year after year. It's been tremendous to see. In 2015, we had about 10,900 people visit. And last year, despite COVID and despite having a shortened season and all these restrictions in place, we have more than 21,000 people visiting BBG, which is just tremendous to think about. Here's another image of our rose garden as it exists today. So another reason for people to come. I love this image because the rose garden is one of those tricky areas. If you are a tour guide, you know that it only has its sort of moment in the sun in June or early June. So a little bit of a blink and you miss it, although I think it's been doing a lot better for us than it has in the past. And of course, our iconic daylily path that people come to seek out in July. But BBG today has a lot more to offer than just our physical gardens, of course. We have really great adult and youth programming. This was taken at Harvest Festival, but it shows some camp, farm in the garden camp activities. This is the actual farm in the garden camp as it happens year after year. Again, we had a pause for it last year, but we are going to bring it back this year bigger and better than ever. So we're really excited about that. Harvest Festival, of course, the granddaddy of our fundraising events and one of the biggest events that we host every year. And then smaller events that we're also known for, including our wreath making and our holiday marketplace that sort of bookends our season in December. The next image is of our group of horticulture interns that we had, I believe it was 3 years ago. Really great program that we run currently in conjunction with NAUMKEG. So they stay at NAUMKEG and spend time both at BBG and at the NAUMKEG gardens, learning about public gardens and historic gardens. They're here with us from May until early August. So it's a really great program. They learn a lot. We learn a lot from them as well. And then finally, this is, of course, not a new garden area that we have planned, but rather an image that I took from a really great garden trip that I went on a few years to the Lake District in Italy, in the Lago Maggiore and Isola Bella gardens. But it's just a reminder to point out that we do more than just educating people on site. We have this terrific garden travel program that we started several years ago now, and it's been doing terrifically well for us. So we've explored some really beautiful garden areas throughout the country and throughout the world. And I know some of you in the audience have participated in some of those trips. I've been really fortunate to have been participated in most of these trips, actually. And I will point out that I pay my own way when I go, but it's really been great, and look forward to travel starting again in the post-COVID world as well. So I want to spend a few minutes just talking about the center house renovation, because it was such a big deal and it was such a big project for us that really was all consuming for several years and really led to some wonderful results and changes for BBG. We had some early images of what we wanted to do. It was quite a modest project at first. We knew that we had this old building, the center house, that was falling and crumbling and not up to fire code. And so we decided we wanted to do something. We started with this approach of having sort of a very small addition to the building. Well, once we started planning seriously with the building, and the project became a lot bigger, shall we say, but it was all good because it was really a lot of things that we needed around the garden. And a lot of people asked me at the time, you know, why are you spending time and money on a building? You're a botanical garden. You should really be focusing on the gardens themselves. Point. But in truth of fact, the creation and the renovation of the center house has had so many follow-on effects for BBG that I think the organization as a whole and the garden as a whole has really benefited. This was a late rendering. This is how it looked close to completion. So it was pretty true to what we had set out to do. And, you know, this, I'll skip a lot of this. This was a slide I put together when we were just finishing this, and I was just touting these numbers because they were really impressive, and I was really proud of our accomplishments. It was definitely the biggest single project, capital project that the garden had undertaken until that time. And of course, the results both on the inside and the outside really speak for themselves. We've created some really beautiful public spaces, classrooms, beautiful new views that we didn't even know we had from the porch areas of the center house. The classroom space that is really a multifunctional space that we've used for anything from board meetings to weddings. The beautiful teaching kitchen that we make a lot of use of. Our wonderful horticultural library that unfortunately we had to also shutter last year, but nothing is forever, and we're absolutely bringing that back as soon as we can. And then, of course, the gallery spaces, which were the oldest parts of the existing center house that sort of led to a whole new programmatic area that the garden undertook in terms of featuring art and the garden. The next image here is one of Nancy Lorenz, who was a wonderful featured artist back in 2019, and who had this great solo exhibit of sculpture that she was inspired by the garden to make all around floral images and ikebana and Japanese art. For those of you who missed it, it was a really wonderful, wonderful show. And because of all the art that's happening at the garden, people get inspired, and our programmers also get inspired in terms of educating people. And so we've really built on some art teaching opportunities that we already have for several years, but now we have so many different classes that happen in terms of watercolor, plein air, pencil drawings, and so forth. And this is just an image of one of the classes taking place in Center House. Of course, there was a lot of back of the house areas of the Center House too that I am equally excited about, but you probably don't see unless you seek them out. The great office space on the second floor, storage space underneath that we always need more of. But you know, the main purpose of the Center House was really as a community space. And we've been really fortunate to have hosted so many different community groups, other nonprofits, local businesses, and then of course, individuals who want their engagements or their weddings to take place here at the garden. So it's been a really great thing to have. And it was something that we couldn't do until we did the renovation of the Center House. So here's just an image of a party that took place not too long ago to give you an idea of what happens here on weekends and after hours. The other project I want to just briefly mention is, of course, happened right on the heels of the Center House itself, which was the entry garden in front of the Center House. This was an area that was also sort of neglected, and after the construction looked pretty terrible, as you can see. So we decided very quickly, what can we do with this space? We decided to have a student design competition. We wanted to reach out to undergraduate and graduate landscape design students and ask them for proposals for what they would do with this quite small space, but a very impactful space potentially. And the winning team was a group from the University of Tennessee University of Tennessee. And at Knoxville, yes, Knoxville, who came up with a really simple, quite modern, striking concept for a garden featuring a quite restrained plant palette of native plants and sort of these iconic Berkshire Hills transformed into a landscape feature. Everyone on the committee that evaluated these proposals loved it, and so we awarded them first prize. This was a project that was rapidly transformed into reality. Here's an image taken in Matt Larkin, our chairman's studio. He is a very active designer, both interior and landscape as well. And so he took these conceptual drawings and started playing with Play-Doh, or I think it was just dough that he stole from the kitchen, to create these actual hillocks and hill features. And so we could see how the thing would look like in real life. And then the garden was put together really amazingly fast. We've found some wonderful funding from our community to make it happen, which again, after doing this really big project for the Center House was really greatly appreciated. And then this is of course what the garden area looks like now. It's become one of my favorite garden features, and I love taking tour groups through here, have them sit in the center here, the council circle as we call it, and to give sort of an overview of BBG is always a real treat. All right, so that's the present, and I'm going to finish the last couple, maybe 10 minutes or so of my talk about the future, which as I hinted at the beginning is quite exciting. I don't like to stand still. My staff and my board don't either, and I think it really shows, and it's really exciting to be involved with an organization that doesn't like to stand still. Master planning, of course, going back to the 1938 plan that I already shared with you, it's been sort of a continual thing that BBG has engaged in over the years and over the decades. And you know, a lot of things get implemented and then you reevaluate and you see what you have and you take the next step. So back in 2012, before I was in my current role, BBG reached out to famous landscape design firm Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates out of New York, and asked them to do a sort of overview of the garden as it stood at that present time and what changes they would propose. It wasn't a full-fledged master plan, but it was really sort of a, let's take a look at our strengths and our weaknesses and see what we can do. And I don't know how much you can see in this image, but this was one of the slides that they shared with the board, which was basically highlighting some areas that they thought could use help. And luckily for us, back within the past couple of years, we've already done a lot of that work, which was focusing on the Center House, the area in front of the Center House, and some other areas. But they had some other ideas. What we ended up doing is actually reaching out to a different firm 2 years ago in 2019. And the thing that prompted that was really that we had expanded physically beyond what Michael Van Valkenburg and others had looked at back in the day. we had luckily been offered to purchase a adjoining property from our long-term neighbors, the Meads. And that's about 5 acres that we now own, that's behind the center house as it currently exists. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that as well. We also, a few years before that, acquired property on the southeast side, adding another more than 5 acres. So, you know, when we kept talking about BBG as being about a 13, 14, 15 acre property, we were actually almost at 24 acres when you put everything together. So we really felt it was time for someone to take a fresh look at the whole area, the whole acreage, and come up with sort of a holistic approach of what the garden should be and could be going forward. And we worked with Nelson Bird Waltz, which some of you may know. They're really a well-established and really exciting landscape architecture firm based out of New York as well. They have done big projects, small projects. We were really excited when they accepted our inquiry to work with us. We didn't know whether we would be maybe perhaps too small of an organization, but they happily engaged with us. And they actually have worked in this area and continue to work in this area. They were involved with Olana down in Hudson and continue to be involved with their master planning. And they are doing work on other areas here as well. So I'm not going to share the details of the plan because, again, it's very, very detailed, but they really focused on the whole areas that we had and where we were, what areas we were using effectively and not so effectively, what kind of views we had, and so forth, what kind of opportunities presented themselves for development. But I did want to focus on this new property that we acquired because that's the first part of this master plan that we're actually putting into reality or creating a reality around. And this property is almost 5 acres, as I said. When we bought it from the prior owners, we sort of drew an imaginary line through half of it because the owners, as part of the agreement, are actually staying in their home for as long as they would like. But they are allowing us, or part of the agreement was that BBG would be allowed to start using the lower half of their property, which is literally lower topographically, to use for our purposes. And we had many ideas of what we wanted to do with this land, but in point of fact, it's already pretty obvious what it should be, and that is a meadow. It's an open field that has been mowed periodically, and we really felt excited about turning this into a very vibrant meadow area for our visitors and for, frankly, for nature and for our environment. So here's just some images of what's going on right now. If you are a tour guide or if you're at BBG regularly, you may know that we had the meadow area open over the last 2 years. People could just stroll through there. The image on the left shows you the entrance into the meadow area. And the thing I like about this property is that it doesn't reveal itself to you from the get-go. It's really sort of this slow reveal, and this is what you see. And then when you walk into the open space, it almost takes your breath away because you have all of a sudden this openness. And so that was very appealing to us. It was very appealing to the landscape designers. But we realized that there was a lot of work that had to be done before we could install an actual meadow. There was a high amount of invasive pressure, both inside the field and the surrounding area. So the image of the right is sort of the beginning of the ugly sausage making of this work, which involves cutting down a lot of undesirable plants, hacking away at the bittersweet and at the various invasive vines that have taken over the perimeter, and really creating a blank slate. But the good news is that we have engaged with a really great team of experts in the field of meadow design, and that's Larry Weiner and his team. Some of you may have heard of him. He's definitely at the top of people's lists when it comes to meadow design and installation. And he and his team were really excited to start working with us. We've just started that work this spring, or this winter, I should say. Larry has more than 30 years of experience doing this kind of work. And the thing that excited us most about it is that they really take the time to do the design aspect. They're not going to just throw a bunch of seed in this area and see what happens. So this is just sort of a glimpse of some of their design work. I'm not going to give you the details of that either, just to mention that they literally have a list of dozens upon dozens of really unique, cool grasses, wildflowers, other kinds of plants that they hope to establish in this area in the coming years. So very exciting, really. Going back to the master plan for a moment, because this talk was primarily about a little bit of the history of BBG, I just wanted to point out that the folks at Nelson Bird Walls were really interested in our history. They didn't want to just steamroll over what we have here and start from square one, but they wanted to take into consideration everything that BBG already had. So they found out about the 1938 painted plan. They got really excited. They saw the old images. They incorporated all of that, including this fabulous timeline that I don't have time to go over, into the master plan document. So it gives you a real sense that they were not going to just give short shrift to the history, but really take that into consideration. They then took a detailed inventory of the various garden areas, including the historic herb garden on the left and the daylily border on the right. Obviously, with the idea that none of those areas would be impacted by any new designs, rather that they would be reincorporated into different garden features. And I think that's really going to be the exciting part of this master plan. And then stepping back, what the landscape architects also did was really look at us in the context of the wider region, which I thought was a really interesting exercise for us to do, because I think too often we just focus on our own backyard or our own 5 acres or 15 acres of botanical garden, and we lose track of where we fit into the bigger picture. And I think now more than ever, that is such an important part of the equation. So again, the Nelson Bird Walls team did a great job asking us and themselves and us, how do we all fit in? Here's just an image of the Housatonic River watershed, and of course the red dot is us here in Stockbridge, and how we really fit in right smack in the middle of that. This image here was kind of news to all of us on the committee that heard about it, but apparently where the Berkshire Botanical Garden sits is an area called the Western New England Marble Valleys, a very unique eco-region, as they're called. So fascinating stuff to learn more about and to also really incorporate into the design for future gardens. Some land use patterns that they studied to see, again, this is the red outline of BBG, how we fit into agricultural land, forest land, wetlands. And we're really sort of part of this string of pearls of undeveloped land that is pretty exciting. And we want to be mindful of that in anything that we do. This is a map showing habitat areas and critical natural landscapes, again, putting us right smack in the middle of a very interesting ecological area. And then, the part of the master plan that is always really fun is to look at images and sort of get the creative juices flowing about the opportunities that we have going forward. These are just some examples of the beautiful native species that are critically endangered that we really want to bring to people's attention, that we want to plant in and around our gardens and the botanical garden as well. And then lastly, for purposes of the master plan, just some sort of images to show you all the different checkboxes that we had, all the different wish list items that we at BBG wanted to tackle with this. As we know we're growing, I already shared with you how much bigger we are, how many more visitors we get than we did even just a few years ago. This is really important stuff to focus on. And just the eye candy of it, of course. We're never going to be one of the formal gardens of England, but one of the thoughts that people had is that maybe we could have a little bit of a formal aspect to some areas of our gardens. And so this is some imagery that would really whet anyone's appetite. But then on the flip side of that, really focus on natural areas as well. We already talked about the meadow area. We also have beautiful woodlands that could be just made more accessible to people and to explore and to plant some really interesting woodlands, naturalistic species there. So that's a work in progress. We have greenhouses that we want to renew and really create more space so that Matt Turnbull and his team can really focus on growing more things here rather than having to buy from growers at great distance, which doesn't make a lot of ecological sense often. But greenhouses are also beautiful structures for visitors to explore and for programming to take place in. Children's play, I just throw that in as well because that was a big discussion for the master plan. We want to make sure that we can be there for all kinds of visitors. And right now, we are so excited to see families with kids come to the garden whenever they do. And we want to be a welcoming environment for them as well. And then we get into sort of the areas, sort of the marginal areas between developed and undeveloped areas. And we want to create learning experience in there. We want to have camp structures that we can use for our Farm in the Garden camp. And in fact, those are the parts of the master plan that are happening or going to happen very soon, because we feel that those are really the top priority for BBG right now. I'm going to leave you with just a few glimpses of some of the actual plans for the garden. This is an image of the north side of Route 102 that has the center house here. And I won't give you all the details. You can look for it later maybe, but just to show you that we're going to really tighten everything up and create some beautiful new spaces for the garden, both on the north side, and then as you get into the south side, really creating some really exciting new formal areas for people to explore that are, I think, are really going to transform the garden and the visitor experience for many. And finally, just a little more to get your thinking going. This is one of the images that the landscape architects left us with for a really beautifully designed terraced garden area that's going to take over in front of the existing education building in one of the future phases of our plans. So before I conclude, I just want to bring it back to the reason for this talk, which was the tour guide training that's starting. And for those of you who do tour guides, I thought I'd end on this note. This was a project that Dora David and I did a few years ago, which was to bring our interpretive signage up to snuff at the garden. We had some pretty old rickety signs, and we put a lot of time and effort into designing some really nice cohesive signage for the garden that are now found throughout our developed gardens, and that also include audio guide hubs that people can explore with their own iPhones or with a device. But this one I thought was an interesting thing to note based on my fascination with BBG history, which is the de Gersdorff border, which is one of the beautiful border areas next to our oval area. And I was always interested because there was an old bronze sign in that garden that said the Karl de Gersdorff Garden. And in doing the research and finding out more about the history of BBG, and then doing some more detailed research for these signs, of course, I very quickly realized that we're not talking about Mr. Karl de Gersdorff, but Mrs. Karl de Gersdorff. And over time, the Mrs. had just sort of left people's consciousness. And very unfortunately, Mrs. de Gersdorff became her husband in terms of honoring her for this garden area. So we righted that wrong when we discovered what had happened. And not only that, but we actually were in contact with one of Mrs. de Gersdorff's descendants, who still lives in Stockbridge, who provided us with this lovely image of her, I believe, great-grandmother, many, many years before she even became involved in the creation of Berkshire Botanical Garden. And by doing this historic research, we were able to give her her due and right a historical wrong that we had in our garden. So with that, I think I'm going to end, and I will open it up to questions if anyone has any at this point.
We do have some questions. Could the guide see a copy of the master plan for details?
Yes, we have printed copies of the master plan here in the offices. We are not broadly presenting that at the present time. We've given several talks to give people an idea of what's going on here. It's certainly no secret. But because we're sort of at an early stage of the implementation, we're not publicizing the master plan broadly. But if any of you, as part of your research or your due diligence for getting ready for the tour guide season, would like to see more, I'm very happy, or anyone in the office would be happy to share with you. It's a hefty tome of about 200 pages, so you can really get some really great detail as you look through that.
And Ramel loved a swinging rope and is wondering if maybe we could have a rope course.
Very, very interesting thought. I'm open to it. Absolutely.
And when did the name change from Berkshire Garden Center, Inc. to Berkshire Botanical Garden?
You know, I don't have the exact date. I believe it was sometime in the 1980s. And there's a funny story around that too, because apparently one of my predecessor directors was so fed up because he kept getting phone calls from people saying, "Are you the Berkshire Garden Center?" And he said, "Yes." And they would ask what their availability of hydrangeas was, or how many potted plants they had, because people thought of it as a garden center. So it was high time to change the nomenclature. Our corporate name, in fact, is still the Berkshire Garden Center. So little known fact there.
And let's see.
Loretta, you had a question?
Can I butt in, Amy?
Oh, of course.
Okay, so just sort of towards the end here, Mike, you mentioned you had a slide. I think you were talking about the meadow, critical native endangered species that the garden is looking at and considering, finding places for. I'd like to have that list because I might want to put that in my own garden. Maybe that's something we could share as a follow-up to this event.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, working with Larry Weiner and his team, they have one of the people on their team is an expert on plants. So he has been just providing us these spreadsheets with a lot of detail of different plants that could be conceivably used. I mean, we wouldn't use all of them necessarily, but really a very broad range of plants. It's a lot of it depends, of course, on sort of micro areas, and we're learning that as well, because when the landscape architects first took a look at this area, they were pretty convinced that there would be these wet areas and dry areas of the meadow. And now as we're exploring the area in more detail, we're actually finding that there's more dry than wet. And so that's obviously going to really impact what kind of plants will do well there ultimately. But happy to share what we know already. So if people have an ability to do their own work in their own backyards, or just have that knowledge, I think it's just so exciting to share that.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that we have wonderful volunteers, they really are dedicated. They want to make a difference. So, I mean, here's one of the ways we can make a difference by really supporting the environment with native plants. Thank you.
Jackie, hi.
Sorry, I just had a quick question too. Is there a phased, do you have kind of a phase plan, even if it's tentative at this point, to that master plan, like what would come after the meadow?
Yeah, we absolutely do. In fact, what we spent a lot of time with the designers was to really make that work logistically as well as from a fundraising perspective. So we actually have 5 discrete phases that we're working off of. And the first phase is going to involve the meadow, as I already mentioned, the camp areas, and the greenhouse areas. So those we feel are top priority. They're exciting. They're sort of core of what we're all about. And they're sort of a little bit on the perimeter of the other garden areas. So that's not going to be too disruptive to cordon those off while we do that work. And I should also mention, because I forgot to do that earlier, for those of you who are leading tours, this year, because we are doing the implementation work to the meadow, that area will be off limits for a while. There's just not going to be much to see. It's going to be closely mowed, and then we're going to do the seeding of that area in the fall. So even though it shows up on the map, it's worth pointing that out when people come to visit this season. Loretta?
I think I saw when I was looking at the chat, I'm not sure, I think it was Jackie had a question about the size of planned tour groups. I don't know if this is the forum to discuss that yet, or we should wait till we do the actual tour guide training, but it was just, because of COVID, wondering about size limitations and that kind of carefulness.
Yeah, I think we'll talk more about that in the other training sessions that are sort of more the nuts and bolts. I know that we've been looking at this very carefully, and we obviously want to have a safe environment for all of the volunteers as well as the visitors. We do feel like that we're going to be in a somewhat better position, touch wood, in early June than we are even now. But that said, we're absolutely continuing with timed entry to the gardens. We're continuing with crowd control and social distancing and mask requirements, and we're going to do our best to communicate that to everyone who's involved here and coming on grounds.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, are there any other questions?
That's it.
Okay, well, thank you all, and look forward to seeing many of you here on grounds very soon. The garden's already looking beautiful, and can't wait to have tours and volunteers around here again. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much.